Today's video is sponsored by Nobility.co.uk, the leading company in selling legal titles in the United Kingdom. Get a 10% discount in any purchase by mentioning Death Row. Money is not the only motive, or even the strongest one, for committing crimes. Many criminal offenses, especially those that involve violence or property destruction, are committed out of emotional motivations, anger, rage, or revenge for real or imagined wrongs. Anger can drive people to do things they otherwise might not. Psychologists know that dealing with a person who is very angry, hurt, or emotionally distraught is like dealing with someone who is mentally disturbed or under the influence of alcohol or drugs. Indeed, strong emotions cause a release of adrenaline, which does act on the body and brain like a drug, resulting in both physiological and psychological changes: enhanced physical strength, heightened alertness, tunnel vision, or obsession with the problem immediately at hand. A very angry person is temporarily, at least, an emotionally disturbed person. Just like we can't choose our eye color, we can't choose the chemical makeup of our brain. This can predispose us to a variety of complications, from clinical depression to epilepsy. Some criminologists believe our biology can also predispose us to criminality. That's not to say criminals are born that way, just that biological factors, including variances in autonomic arousal, neurobiology, and neuroendocrine functioning, have been shown to increase the likelihood that we might commit criminal acts. Individuals need to be responsible for their own actions. An understanding of root causes cannot and should not be seen as a way to absolve us from personal accountability. However, while individuals have an obligation to act responsibly and with respect for their fellow citizens, communities have a responsibility to address those conditions which hinder healthy development and can become the breeding ground for crime is primarily the outcome of multiple adverse social understanding of its roots. Convicted murderers. Richard Eugene Hickock was born on June 6, 1931, in Kansas City, Kansas. Perry Smith was born on October 27, 1928, in Huntington, Nevada. Richard Hickock and Perry Smith murdered 4 members of the Clutter family on their Kansas farm on November 15, 1959. The murderers, their victims, and the crime became the subject of the 1966 best-selling book, In Cold Blood, written by Truman Capote. The 2 criminals met at the Kansas State Penitentiary in 1958. From their backgrounds, they seemed an unlikely pair. Hickock had grown up in a stable family on a farm near Kansas City. Athletic and popular, he graduated high school in 1949. But his family did not have the money for him to go on to college. This disappointment gave way to a greater tragedy in 1950. He suffered head injuries from a car crash that year, which left his face a bit lopsided and his eyes unleveled. Or as Capote once wrote, it looked like his head had been halved like an apple, and then put together a fraction off center. For Perry Smith, his troubles started at an early age. His parents scraped together a living on the rodeo circuit, performing as Tex and Flo. His father was a red-headed man of Irish ancestry, while his mother was a full-blooded Cherokee. His parents eventually broke up over his mother's drinking and philandering. At the age of 6, Perry Smith moved to San Francisco with his mother and 3 other siblings. She eventually put him in an orphanage where he was abused by nuns for his frequent bedwetting. A wild child, he spent time in other institutions and was caught stealing for the first time when he was 8. Later reunited with his father, Smith spent some time in Nevada and Alaska. At 16, Perry Smith joined the Merchant Marines and later went into the U.S. Army. He served in Japan and Korea. In 1952, Smith had a serious motorcycle accident, which permanently damaged his legs and left him in chronic pain. He spent months recovering from his injuries and then moved to Alaska to be with his father. The two had a falling out in 1955, and Smith started his life of crime later that year. He and a partner stole some office equipment from a business in Phillipsburg, Kansas. Caught by a police officer with the goods after they were pulled over for a traffic stop, the pair ended up in the Phillipsburg jail. They escaped through an open window and stole a car. After splitting up, Smith made his way to Worcester, Massachusetts, and down to New York City, where he eventually apprehended by the FBI. He went back to Kansas, where he was tried and convicted on a series of charges. Sentenced to 5 to 10 years, Smith was sent to the Kansas State Penitentiary in Lansing. Hickock also found his way to the Kansas State Penitentiary because of theft. Married at 19, he worked a series of regular jobs, as an ambulance driver, a car painter, and a mechanic. The young couple had 3 sons together and began living beyond their means, and Hickock soon started supplementing his income by writing bad checks. After he had an affair, the couple split up and Hickock married his mistress. She, however, divorced him while he was serving time at the penitentiary for check fraud and other crimes. For a time, Hickock and Smith were cellmates. Hickock claimed to be a regular person, but he possessed a mean streak and was prone to terrible headaches. A schemer by nature, he was the more practical of the pair. Smith was more of a dreamer, hoping to strike rich through a series of unrealistic ventures. Terribly self-conscious of his lack of formal schooling, he liked to work on his vocabulary and use big words in his conversations. After Perry Smith's release, Hickock ended up sharing with a cell with Floyd Wells. Wells had once worked for Herbert Clutter on his farm years earlier. Mentioning that Clutter sometimes paid $10,000 in a week in business expenses to Hickock, Wells soon fielded many questions on the Clutter family from his cellmate, including whether there was a safe in his office. Wells incorrectly said yes, leading Hickock to believe that there was a big score to be made at the Clutter's River Valley farm. From the start, Hickock talked of killing all of the family so that there would be no witnesses. Writing his former cellmate, Hickock asked Perry Smith to join him in the robbery and murder of the Clutters. The two met up in Olathe, Kansas, on November 14, 1959. In Hickock's car, he had assembled many of the tools they needed for the grisly crime: a shotgun, a flashlight, a fishing knife, and gloves. They picked up a few other items during their drive to the Clutter's farm in Holcomb, Kansas. Late that night, Richard Eugene Hickock and Perry Smith entered the Clutter's house through an unlocked door. They woke up Herbert Clutter and asked him where his safe was, but he denied having a safe. If the two criminals had ever spent any time in Holcomb or nearby Garden City, they would have known that Herbert Clutter was famous for never having any cash on hand. He almost always paid by check. There was no safe and very little cash around. According to their confessions, Smith tied up Herbert Clutter, his wife Bonnie, their son Kenyon, and their daughter Nancy in different rooms of the house. After searching the house, they learned that Hickock's tip from Wells was no good. Hickock and Smith found about $40 to $50 in the house in total. Rather than just walk away from this botched robbery, the pair decided to kill the Clutters. Smith first cut Herbert Clutter's throat and then shot him in the head. Oddly, he had placed a mattress box under Herbert earlier so that he would not be uncomfortable. Smith had also put a pillow under Kenyon's head only to return later to shoot him in the face. Both Nancy and Bonnie Clutter were also shot in the head, but who the actual shooter was unclear. Hickock claimed that Smith shot both women, while Smith said that Hickock shot Nancy and Bonnie, but later tried to change his story. The two killers fled the scene in the early hours of November 15th and returned to Olathe for a time. A short time, they hit the road, ending up in Mexico and Florida before ending up in Las Vegas, where they were apprehended by the authorities a few weeks later. Hickock, who always tried to be the tough guy, quickly cracked during questioning and made a full confession. In the meanwhile, friends of Nancy Clutter had discovered the gruesome remains of the well-respected family. Most everyone knew and liked the Clutters. Their murders sent shockwaves through the communities of Holcomb and Garden City. Once a sleepy and trusting area, residents began locking their doors and staying awake at night in fear that they might be next. They were also concerned that one or more of their own may have committed this heinous act. Writers Truman Capote and Harper Lee were already in Garden City when Hickock and Smith were brought back from Las Vegas in January 1960. Working on a story for the New Yorker magazine, Capote, with Lee as a research assistant, had been interviewing local residents and following the investigation to write a piece on the impact of the murders on the quiet community. Sometime after their arraignment, Capote and Lee were able to talk with the confessed killers and began to build a rapport with them. They revealed much about themselves and the case to Capote, which Capote wrote about in the best-selling non-fiction book In Cold Blood. In March, Capote and Lee returned to Kansas to attend Hickock and Smith's trial. The criminal duo were convicted and sentenced to death. For years, they were jailed at the Kansas State Penitentiary while they appealed their case. Their lawyers were able to put off the killer's execution several times, but ultimately their appeals failed. Hickock and Smith were executed by hanging at the Kansas State Penitentiary on April 14, 1965. When asked if he had any last words, Hickock declined, but he requested to address the CB agents who had worked on his case and now were present as witnesses to his execution. Hickock told them he had no hard feelings towards them, shook each agent's hand, and simply said, "Goodbye." Smith, in contrast, attempted to speak beyond the room when he addressed the media representatives and declared, "Capital punishment is legally and morally wrong." Hickock was executed first and was pronounced dead at 12:41 a.m. Smith followed shortly afterward and was pronounced dead at 1:19 a.m. Thank you for watching Death Row.